Last night I heard this politician talking about a brand new vision. I liked his plan, but it came undone when he got around to goddamn gun. I don't know what world he's living in, but everybody ain't your friend. There's folks that hate the life I live, killing themselves just to kill my kid. Goddamn gun, keep us strong. That's what this country was founded on. Hey, we might as well give up and run if we let them take our goddamn gun.
It's just 27 words strung together into one simple sentence, yet its meaning and purpose in our modern society has created one of the biggest debates in recent history. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
You come in, you brandish your little book as if I don't know
My little book, that's the Constitution of the United States, our founding document.
I know what's in your Constitution.
Do you really?
I've been debating this for a very long time.
The American people love their guns.
You have a right to own a gun. I have a right to not own a gun and still feel safe in this society.
The assault weapons ban, guns,
Gun control advocates.
assault rifles, assault rifles, assault rifles, assault weapons,
Automatic weapons.
High-capacity magazines.
Riddled.
mass slaughter.
We gotta stop making this a taboo subject to everyone.
There's no way a ban on guns is going to get to the president. Huh, shocking.
Guns are synonymous with America.
Now listen, son. I'm sending you out to the National Shooting Championships because I want you to learn how to shoot.
Glorified in popular literature and music, in television programs, video games, and movies.
I'm a lead farmer.
Guns are everywhere in our culture, but the stereotype of the typical gun owner is not that of the average American.
There's people who like guns and people who don't like guns, and the people who strongly support gun control often despise the characteristics they associate with gun ownership. They'll view a typical gun owner as a politically extreme right-wing person, as a person who's indifferent to the suffering of victims of gun violence, as an ignorant backwoods hick. Because they dislike the stereotype associated with gun ownership, they feel no qualms about restricting gun ownership very severely. They don't think that group has any rights that they need to respect.
The amount of diversity in the shooting community here in the United States is actually quite phenomenal. I think on TV and maybe news reports, there's a certain stereotype that people have in their heads, but really, if you come out to almost any shooting range, you see all sorts of races, men, women, young, old. It's really a diverse sport, and that's kind of the fun part about it all.
I'm the spokesperson for the San Francisco chapter of the Pink Pistols, a LGBTQ firearm association, or a gay gun group. There's this perception that gay people don't own firearms, and so we are helping to dispel that.
It's a new, younger gun control movement that's about the Pink Pistols and about California and New York, because that's where gun control is. It is more about civil rights. We're more interested in making sure that the grandmother in East Oakland has a shotgun, because she's the one who has inadequate police service. Having her have that firearm is the most important thing.
People have this misperception that most people in East Oakland are criminals, and they're not. Most people here are law-abiding citizens. They rely on the right of self-defense to literally stay alive, to protect their homes, protect their families, protect their businesses.
They understand that they need them for protection because in places like South Central or Watts or Compton, wherever, you can't always depend on the police to come in and help you in time. In fact, in some areas, they won't even come at all.
When you touch the Second Amendment, you can't become more anti-American, because America would not be without her guns.
The gun is often referred to as the great equalizer, a tool for self-defense that does not rely on strength or incredible speed to be used. It allows a 5-foot, 90-pound woman to defend herself against a 6-foot, 200-pound attacker. Yet this machine of steel and lead has no mechanism for determining if it's being used for good or bad. Once its firing pin strikes the shell's primer, the bullet is sent hurling down range to hit either an inanimate object or strike a living body, causing injury or death. This quandary of good and evil that the gun possesses is at the heart of our national debate. Both sides clinging to their vision of the gun, but not willing to listen to the other, holding on to fear and misconceptions while waging a war of rhetoric.
Depriving citizens of the right to defend themselves, the ability to defend themselves, is not reasonable.
It's words and concepts that this war is about, not the gun.
The Second Amendment is so simple, it's an absolute tragedy that the question exists. What does it mean? Keep and bear arms means they're mine, you can't have them, and I've got some on me right now, and they're loaded.
Some politicians and scholars argue that the Second Amendment to our Constitution is outdated and no longer valid in our society. But can we throw out the foundation of our country and the individual bricks called civil rights in the name of public safety? What did the Founding Fathers envision when they wrote the Second Amendment? And can we continue to pay the price with human lives to support it?
Guns have been a part of American culture ever since the first Europeans showed up with their guns 4 centuries ago. And ever since, they've been an important part of what America stands for.
By the time of the American Constitution, English law had recognized a right to have arms for 100 years.
It recognized a pre-existing right. Just like your First Amendment right to assemble, your First Amendment right to freedom of religion, your First Amendment right to freedom of speech, your Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms was not created by the federal government. Those were all seen by the framers as fundamental, pre-existing human rights, which all humans had simply by virtue of being human.
In England, in the late 1680s, there was the so-called Glorious Revolution, a largely bloodless revolution that began the constitutional monarchy that we now see in England today. And one of the things that the new monarchs, William and Mary, were required to adopt was the English Bill of Rights. One of the provisions was the right of Protestants to have arms, suitable to their condition and subject to control by law. And that was understood as a protection against the government disarming people, especially disarming Protestants, because there was this fear at the time of undue Catholic influence.
You as an individual have a right to own and carry firearms for all legitimate purposes. And at the same time, your ownership, use, and carrying of arms is also a responsibility which you owe to the community. In the militia of the colonial era, all able-bodied males had the obligation to own a militia-suitable firearm, to bring it to periodic militia practices, and of course to serve in the militia to defend their community.
When you had the struggle between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists in trying to ratify and draft the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists had a real problem. They're going like, we're really here about liberty, this is a big thing to us, and we want to put this Bill of Rights in there. And they didn't put it there because it fit on the word processor. They put it there because they realized and recognized that it was the ultimate guarantor of all of our freedoms. When the courts fail, when the legislature fails, when the political process fails, there's one final way to protect your freedom and your liberty.
It's not about hunting. It's not about any other nonsense they make up. It's not about some collective right to the National Guard that wasn't created until 1900s. It's about our right to defend ourselves from tyranny, whether it's from criminal element or an oppressive government.
Pro-gun lobbyists on here saying to me, well, the reason we need to be armed is because of tyranny from our own government. And I've always laughed at them. And I've always said, don't be so ridiculous. Your own government won't turn itself on you. But actually, when you look at this, it's nothing to do with guns. But actually, this is vaguely tyrannical behavior by the American government.
Right now, the debates in American courts are not at all about the right to keep and bear arms as a deterrent to government tyranny. It's an interesting question what the courts would say if really presented with this kind of question. I need to have fully automatic guns. I need to have surface-to-air missiles. If that issue comes before American courts, I doubt American courts would be willing to endorse it, regardless of the historical evidence for that.
The thought of a civilian uprising against tyranny seems like a far-fetched idea of a Hollywood feature film, but it has happened. World War II was winding down at the end of 1945, and boys that left small-town USA were returning as war-hardened men set to start their lives. In Athens, Tennessee, the return of these men would set the stage for a unique battle between bullets and ballots.
Athens was probably having a peak experience of drama and excitement and positive energy flowing because what they call the boys were coming back from the Second World War.
One aspect of this excitement was that many hoped that the boys would settle some score of injustice that had come at the hands of the corrupt sheriff of McMinn County and the political machine that he represented.
While the soldiers had been away at war, you had a kind of a flipping upside down of the status of the whole community, in the sense that there were deputies that would have worked for the local sheriff who had become able and were kind of free to run roughshod over the population. There certainly would have been a number of ways for them not only to have had power, but to have made money.
In those days, the sheriff and the deputies got paid a percentage of the fines they imposed on citizens, whether they were guilty or innocent.
So there was a local election that was coming up, and so this would have given a golden opportunity for a political sea change to occur. There was really a polarization at that point. The traditions say the sheriff counts the votes, ultimately, in charge of the ballot box. So the veterans are saying, you come out and vote this time, and it won't be like it's always been. These votes will be counted.
The train came in at 8 o'clock. 26 armed deputies got off of that train. Some with sidearms, some with other type of arms.
These armed deputies were nothing more than hired enforcers, brought in to intimidate the town folk and watch over things, making sure the vote went the way the sheriff wanted.
At the polling place, like each party was allowed to have 2 checkers. And the problem there was that the checkers were armed deputies usually, and they were threatening people.
A local and well-respected black member of the community, Tom Gillespie, then walks in to vote.
And some redneck is telling him, you're not going to get to vote. And he begins to hurl racial epithets. And Tom goes forward to vote, and the guy pulls out a gun and shoots him. Well, now suddenly the thing's taken to a whole different level, of course. And then into the middle of all of this, the sheriff comes with several cars, and they go in and get the ballot boxes. There are guns drawn, and the crowd is being pushed back, and they get the ballot boxes and head to the jail, and then they begin to make calls, and other ballot boxes are brought to the jail, and other precincts are shut down. And I think you've got people running around saying, what are we going to do? I even think you have people approaching some of these veteran leaders saying, hey, guys, put up or shut up. You're the ones that said that the votes were going to be counted.
We went to the armor. He had called the janitor, which is the guy's name was Percy Berger. And we knew well, and Dad picked his pistol up and says, I don't want you to get in any trouble about this, Percy, but we're going to take the rifles.
I think that he may have had a broader concept of trying to create a situation where some stable minds had some guns and to liberate the ballots themselves.
Gunfire then erupted from both the square and the jailhouse and continued deep into the night.
What ultimately became a problem, everybody was running out of ammunition. Then what are you going to do? And so at that point, you've got some veterans that tape some dynamite together, and they run down the street and throw it out under the front of the jail, and it lifts the front of the jail up and sets it down again and creates a lot of smoke and noise, and then all of a sudden your white flag-like devices are being waved out of the jail, and the deal's done.
The Battle of Athens ends with the liberation of the ballot boxes and an honest counting of the votes. The GI ticket wins with 70% of the vote.
I do not want anybody to say that we were right. We weren't. We were wrong. We did something that was wrong that turned out right.
So do I think that the Battle of Athens is a moment that can be used as a concrete historical example of when people rose up and overwhelmed a negative political situation? Absolutely. But making that a sufficient condition for anything that we might want to do in terms of guns and ammunition and activities of resistance, I think at the very, very minimum, you've got to be very careful and judicious with those connections.
Whether the Battle of Athens is a case for the Second Amendment being used against tyranny or not, it is an example of how a community can rise up and overthrow a bunch of self-serving politicians.
One of the most disturbing things about gun control in American history is its relationship with race and racism. Gun laws were one of the ways in which white people kept African Americans and other racial minorities second-class citizens. Founding fathers had racially discriminatory gun laws, barring slaves and free blacks from owning guns. Because of slavery, many states had laws which either said slaves can't possess firearms without the consent of their master. A minority of the more restrictive states said they can't have weapons at all and we don't care about the master's consent one way or the other.
Even after the 13th Amendment and the end of the Civil War, state laws were carefully written to keep the black population disarmed.
So the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, was speedily ratified and without much controversy, including in the South. But what the Confederate state governments do is try to perpetuate the system without calling it slavery. They take the slave codes. Oh, well, we don't need slave codes anymore. We don't have any slaves. But they're reenacted as the black codes. In 1865, 1866, legislatures of Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and on, create these laws which impose special restrictions on black people. And another major feature of the slave codes reenacted as black codes was special restrictions on gun ownership by blacks.
Some African Americans joined up with the Union Army, where they served in black regiments and were armed by the United States government. When the war ended, the U.S. government owed all its soldiers years of back pay and offered the soldiers an unusual deal. You could take your gun home with you if you wish, and we'll deduct the amount from your back pay. Many soldiers took those guns because they figured the government was never going to pay. For a black man returning to the South, he knew he was going into hostile territory and that the whites were not going to be happy with his freedom and that he might need that gun to protect himself against violence.
Because it was well understood that the disarmed black population would be at the mercy of the domestic terrorist organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of the White Camilla, and on, which were attempting to terrorize the blacks into staying in a permanent condition of servility.
And racist gun control wasn't limited to the blacks.
There was a major influx of Chinese and Hispanic immigrants to California at the time. And literally in the 20s, the San Francisco Chronicle reported that the reason that concealed carry licensing was brought into California was to quiet the Tong community or take the passion out of the Hispanic community. So it's very clear that gun control, and specifically carry licensing, was animated by a racial bias.
I should say, there are those in the gun control community that are upset that I would talk about racism and gun control laws, but we wouldn't talk about the history of voting laws if we didn't talk about the history of racially discriminatory voting laws. I don't believe that every gun control law today is racially discriminatory, far from it. But we should always be careful when passing laws where there is a history of racism to make sure we're not repeating the mistakes of the past.
There was a famous case out of Florida where the court dealt with this, and one of the judges was fair enough to stand up and say in a written opinion that this was never meant to be applied to the white population. Because, of course, if the sheriff is allowed, or if the police chief is allowed to say that somebody doesn't have moral character to have a gun, there's no way to test that. There's no objective qualification there. And oftentimes, historically, what that meant was that the sheriff took a look at you, and if you looked a little too dark or didn't fit their view of what a gun owner should look like, then they figured you didn't really have good cause to have that handgun.
So you had a lot of nominally neutral laws in the South, which in practice were only enforced against the blacks to keep them, to the greatest extent possible, disarmed, unable to protect themselves against domestic terrorism, and as docile and controlled as possible.
I think lost in the gun debate is the importance that firearms played in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. There was a group called the Deacons for Defense and Justice, and literally they were their church deacons. They were respected by the community. They used firearms to defend the civil rights workers in some of the most dangerous parts of the South. And these were men who were usually Korea and World War II veterans, so they understood firearms, they'd seen what they'd done, and they'd gotten a taste of equality. The U.S. Army was a far more liberal place than the South in the 60s.
Civil rights workers such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, were subject to arrest, harassment, and murder by law enforcement and the KKK. The lynching of James Earl Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964 showed the Deacons that the peaceful methods of nonviolent civil disobedience of the civil rights movement needed to apply a little bit of the Second Amendment to protect the student workers.
There was a major overlap between the sheriff's deputies and the KKK. By day, they wore a badge, and at night, they wore the sheet. And these respected members of the community knew that the only way they would defend the safe house of SNCC or NAACP was to threaten these gentlemen with the force of firearms if they came into their communities at night.
By taking up arms to defend themselves and others, the Deacons for Defense caused a paradigm shift in the South by demonstrating self-defense and reliance against the Klan and corrupt law enforcement that supported racism. Providing security for the civil rights workers' safe houses at night and for protest marches and demonstrations, the Deacons' actions of armed self-defense was the enactment of the natural law that the Founding Fathers sought to secure in the Second Amendment. The Deacons' success of affecting the civil rights movement in the South was noticed by two Oakland, California black radicals, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton. Needing a way to combat police brutality, Newton and Seale and other members of the Black Panther Party armed themselves, shadowing local law enforcement, ensuring traffic stops of blacks and their interactions were properly conducted.
Looking back from a modern perspective on the conflict between the Black Panthers and Oakland police, it's hard to know what the truth was, but it certainly was a sign of the times, if you will, that the police may not have been treating the Black Panthers very fairly. It's also very clear that firearms in that community protected that community.
Extending their protest for black equality and to bring statewide attention to police brutality in Oakland, the Panthers peacefully marched into the state capitol in Sacramento with loaded firearms.
And Bobby Seale made a statement. We have prayed, we have pleaded, we have cried for equal rights. We must do something before it's too late. And with that, they walked into the Capitol with guns.
And it led to some of the strangest politics around. You had a Republican state senator introducing a bill to ban the loaded open carry of firearms. And then you had a Republican governor by the name of Ronald Reagan signing that bill to ban loaded open carry.
Just the thought of black people arming themselves and being aware of their rights, like the Panthers were, I think that honestly scares a lot of people.
This whole thing about controlling guns was never, ever about public safety. It's always been about controlling groups that were politically inconvenient.
We continue to see this struggle to restrict individual rights in the name of public safety. The battle has progressed to include socioeconomics and cultural divisions with restriction on concealed carry permitting in urban communities in the name of public safety, and color still plays a factor. 2012 saw 506 homicides in the city of Chicago, nearly 100 more than all U.S.-led coalition fatalities in Afghanistan that same year. Most of these deaths were caused by gang-on-gang violence perpetrated by young blacks. Yet, there is no congressional investigation or task force trying to solve gang violence in this country. But have 20 white children in upper-middle-class suburbia mowed down by a possibly insane and medicated individual, and the whole power of the government is unleashed.
If there is anyone out there who still wonders if the dream of our founders is alive in our time.
In this celebrated era of equality in our nation's history, it appears that the safety of white America is still more important to our government than the safety of minorities in our inner cities. Chicago has long been associated with gangsters and guns. Notorious criminals like Bugs Moran, Tony Accardo, and Al Capone all profited off bootlegging during the U.S. government's prohibition on alcohol from 1920 to 1933. Championed by groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League.
Twice in a few weeks, the government has struck. This time a brewery on South State Street.
Prohibition came about with the passage of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution and the Volstead Act, which outlawed the manufacturing, importation, exportation, and the sale of alcoholic beverages within the borders of the United States. The ban, like many federal bans, targeted minority groups, like Catholic immigrants from Europe and blacks who were being blamed for crime and moral corruption in the inner cities. Celebrated by the progressives of the day and Protestant groups, Prohibition was only effective in opening the door to illegal bootlegging operations and organized crime, quenching America's thirst for alcohol.
Alcohol prohibition in the 1920s was a disaster on many levels and caused a huge increase in organized crime because the government, by creating alcohol prohibition, had essentially given a huge guaranteed revenue stream to organized criminals who would supply illegal alcohol. The organized crime syndicates sometimes fight turf wars with each other, shoot each other up. St. Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago was one notorious example of that, which really shocked the entire country.
The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was a gangland execution of 7 North Side Irish mobsters that were savagely shot down with 2 Thompson submachine guns. The event shocked the American public and led to the first major federal gun control act.
And they used machine guns, and so the government felt the need to start to restrict those. So back then, they probably couldn't get away with just banning things. So they started to tax machine guns, and so you couldn't have them unless you paid this tax. That was the start of the NFA.
The National Firearms Act of 1934 regulates automatic weapons, short-barrel shotguns, rifles, suppressors, and destructive devices such as grenades and bombs, and a broad catch-all category called any other weapon. The act does not outlaw these items, but creates a registration process and a tax schedule that must be met before a citizen can possess these weapons.
So to the untrained eye, if you look at both of these firearms, they're quite similar in nature, right? But one of these is a machine gun, and one of these is a semi-automatic. How do we tell the difference? So we have a safe, a semi-automatic setting, and a fully automatic setting. These three settings will actually tell you whether or not this is in fact a machine gun. If we compare this to the AR-15 sporting rifle, you'll notice right away that we only have two settings on our selector switch. One is safe and one is fire. That third position of automatic is not available on this firearm. Now, there are other differences internally in the weapon system of an M16 that differ from that of an AR-15, but externally, that's the easiest way to verify which one is a machine gun and which is a semi-automatic sporting rifle.
For most individuals unfamiliar with firearms, these differences are unseen, which leads to a lot of misunderstanding between fully automatic weapons and the modern sporting rifle you can pick up at your local Walmart.
This particular firearm and its fully automatic capability is in the neighborhood of $15,000 to $20,000. The other thing that we have to think about is the actual legislated process that we have to follow to possess something like this. The actual background check and 6-month wait and $200 tax that is paid to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms.
The intent of the National Firearms Act was to create a tax evasion trap for gangsters using submachine guns in their criminal activities. Nice idea on paper. But what criminal would submit to a background check and purchase the required $200 tax stamp? What the law does ensure is that only wealthy Americans of the era were able to own and enjoy these classes of firearms. America was not the only country dealing with gun control in the first half of the 20th century. Stalin and the Soviets methodically disarmed the citizens of the USSR, starting in 1917, and by 1929, passed sweeping gun control legislation, stripping gun ownership from all but the state, allowing Stalin to implement his policies of redistribution of farmland into collectives through armed force against an unarmed citizenry. These policies resulted in over 10 million deaths caused by state-sponsored murder and starvation.
Hitler was also using gun control to expand his fascist ideas. He used the gun laws to disarm Jews and gypsies, the mentally ill, homosexuals. It was how he was able to disarm and then murder 6 million Jews. Both Stalin and Hitler used gun control to silence their political enemies or those people who they didn't like. And in many ways, that was the ultimate silence because, of course, they were headed off to gulags and gas chambers. Most Americans are afraid of gun registration because it's been pretty historically established that registration leads to confiscation. So it's hard to take guns that you don't know exist. Personally, I'm not that afraid of registration because I want the government to know I have firearms. And the sole purpose of those firearms, as outlined by the Second Amendment, is to provide for the security of a free nation.
A quirky fact related to the 1938 German Weapons Act is that a lot of its legal concepts were used in the 1968 Gun Control Act by its co-author, Democrat Senator Tom Dodd, who had spent time in Germany after the war as a prosecutor at Nuremberg. Dodd even sought a national firearms registration, but was unsuccessful. The broad legislation created the basis for much of the gun laws we have today, and the continued tradition of restricting minorities' access to guns through economics.
The year before the Gun Control Act was passed, Detroit and Newark suffered their worst race riots in American history, riots that destroyed these cities and lasted for days. When National Guardsmen came to restore order, they were shot at by snipers. Congress commissioned a report to determine the causes of the unrest, and the report put at least part of the blame on the easy availability of guns in urban areas. So there was a sense that if we could restrict some of the guns in the hands of people in our inner cities, read racial minorities, we would have much less violence in society.
The Act controls interstate commerce of firearms, like mail order, and applies today to internet-based gun sales. It created the federal firearms license system to register, control, and track gun dealers and manufacturers. It also stopped the importation of inexpensive small-caliber handguns along with surplus military automatic and semi-automatic weapons into the country, enhancing the 1934 National Firearms Act.
Emergency. There's a man at my front door ringing the doorbell trying to get in my house. Okay, what's your name, ma'am? Donna Hopper. Oh, God! He's coming into your bedroom window? There's a gun in the window. Okay. I got a gun. I'm going to get my gun out.
It takes time for a responding officer to arrive at your domicile.
Ma'am, what are you arming yourself with? I just lost it. Oh, God, hurry, please. Okay, yeah. Come. Donna, got it. My window. He broke my window. He broke your window, or did you just shoot? No, he just broke it.
The most significant risks a criminal faces is not going to prison for a long period of time. That's pretty unlikely. His greatest risk is that he'll run into an armed victim who might shoot him, and possibly fatally.
Where in the hell's the police? They're on their way, ma'am. Oh, he's coming back. I can see his shadow. Okay, where is he at? Donna, listen to that kid. He's coming into my front yard. Oh, God, he's coming to the window. I'm going to shoot him again.
One thing people should remember is that when something is happening to you, if someone's attacking you and you're in your home, the dispatcher that's telling you to wait for the police, she's in no harm. The police are in no harm. But you're very much at a risk for harm with that person that's in your home attacking you.
He's coming through the window. He's coming in. He's coming in. Is he coming into the house? Yeah. I got him. You shot him again? Yes. Or you shot at him? No, I shot him this time. He's coming through the window. I shot him 3 shots. Oh, my God. He's on the ground.
Especially women, if we're alone, we don't have any business not having guns in our house.
We applaud that woman for being able to defend her family and her home, and we're glad she had the presence of mind to do that. Unfortunately, the statistics show that that isn't always the case.
I have 2 sources of information that bear on defensive gun use. First of all, there was a survey done back in 1994 where a nationally representative sample of adults in the U.S. were asked questions about defensive gun use. So the estimate that I arrived at was circa 2.5 million defensive gun uses in 1993.
Shooter ready.
5 million people with disabilities, now that ranges from elderly to paraplegics, are victims of violent crime every year. So it does make a difference. I mean, it's something that we need to be aware of. People that do the crime pick on people they perceive to be weak. It's our responsibility to do what we can to protect ourselves.
A disabled veteran used a World War II-era gun to shoot an intruder who kicked in his door over the weekend.
So I've got a .32 automatic pistol my dad sent back in 1948. It's really old, but it worked good.
You know, we are in the midst of a public health and safety crisis, one of the worst that we face. Every year, 30,000 people are killed with guns. Every day, 32 are murdered. 90 are otherwise killed.
What's surprising to many people is that more than half of those are suicides. The homicides that do exist, obviously there's far too many of them with firearms or any other means. We know that about 2/3 of those are recidivist criminals or gang members. So when you think about it in its bigger picture, the gun problem in America, to the extent there is one, is a problem of suicide and gang use of firearms, and not so much the law-abiding citizen who gets in trouble.
The right of the people shall not be infringed, so the Second Amendment says, written in a time when the citizen was expected to protect themselves and their community. But as we have seen over the past 2 centuries, the right has continually been infringed, mostly by state and city laws.
Many of the gun control laws that are adopted are designed to try to make it easier to take guns out of the hands of criminals and of gang members. However, they're generally written so broadly that they affect everybody else. And so sometimes the laws are designed to target gang members or criminals, but they apply much more broadly. Sometimes it's like trying to kill a fly with a fire hose.
The apex of that infringement came in the Washington, D.C. Firearms Control Regulations Act of 1975. Which restricted residents from owning handguns or high-capacity semi-automatic firearms, with the exception of those owned by police officers or guns registered before 1976.
One thing we know is that the gun bans weren't terribly effective at disarming the criminals. D.C. banned handguns and effectively banned shotguns and rifles for self-defense in 1976. 10 years later, when I moved to Washington, D.C. to go to college there, it was the murder capital of the United States. So it's clear that efforts to ban guns just do not work very well.
The law was challenged in 2003 with the financial backing of Robert A. Levy of the Cato Institute and involved 6 plaintiffs, including Dick Heller and Tom Palmer. Palmer had moved to D.C. after a hate crime incident in California.
Tom Palmer he had a very sympathetic story. Tom Palmer was a gay man who in the past had been the victim of gay bashing efforts, and he tells the story about one night up in San Jose, California, when he was walking down the street and he was attacked by a gang of 20 men, skinheads or whatnot, who were yelling anti-gay slurs and were threatening to kill him. And he recalled, after first running away from them, that he was carrying a firearm. And when he stopped and pointed his firearm at the people who were chasing after him, they immediately
stopped chasing them and went the other way. It's just a good example of how, for people who are disfavored, having access to a firearm may be the last line of protection.
Dick Heller was a federal security officer that carried a gun every day to work, but could not get a permit to own a gun. The lower court dismissed the case, which went to the Court of Appeals that resulted in two opinions: that only Heller had standing in the case, and that the Second Amendment extends beyond the militia to be an individual right.
Gun control advocates have often no shortage of idealism. And in Washington, D.C., they passed this predictably ineffective ban on handguns because they were idealistic. The city council thought that if Washington, D.C. passed this law, then other states would follow suit. And it would lead to a nationwide trend of civilian disarmament.
The ruling was appealed to the Supreme Court and heard in 2008 as District of Columbia versus Heller.
There are quite a few Supreme Court cases that talked about the Second Amendment, usually in passing. They often only quoted the right provision, the right of the people to keep in their arms shall not be infringed, and didn't even mention the preamble, the well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Then in 1939, in the Miller case, the Supreme Court for the first time squarely confronted the question of a federal regulation that was challenged on Second Amendment grounds.
The Miller case involved a sawed-off shotgun and the recently passed National Firearms Act that required the gun to be registered and have a $200 tax stamp.
And the court, in a rather opaque opinion, held that that law, which was a ban on sawed-off shotguns, was constitutionally permissible. And some language in it suggested that the right was not an individual right, but only a right that belonged to the states. Following 1939, lower courts read that ambiguous decision as clearly rejecting the individual rights. Then, starting with the 1990s, there was a flurry of scholarship by lawyers and law professors, published often in pretty prestigious scholarly journals, which said, wait a minute, the right to keep and bear arms was long understood as an individual right.
So after nearly 50 years, the Second Amendment was heard again in the Supreme Court. In a 5-4 decision, the court affirmed that the Second Amendment applied to the individual as well as the state. It also established that the right could be reasonably regulated.
Heller makes clear individuals have a right to own guns, that we can never get rid of all the guns, and the government can never come take all your guns.
But the decision was not a clear win for the words, shall not be infringed.
At the same time, the Heller case made crystal clear that there's plenty of room for states and localities to pass gun control laws that promote public safety. And so I think in some ways the Heller case embodies what we might think of as a reasonable right to bear arms rather than a radical right to bear arms that might be favored by one or the other sides in the gun debate.
You know, personally, I found the Heller decision liberating, that the Second Amendment gives you a definable, limited right to own a gun in your home. Let's talk about what we can do in the context of that decision, in the context of the majority opinion by Scalia that said that it can still be regulated for the sake of public health and safety. Let's talk about the things that we all agree on that have the potential to make this the safer nation that we all want.
A second case in 2010, McDonald versus Chicago, affirmed that the Second Amendment applies to the states through the 14th Amendment that can have limited restrictions such as not allowing the mentally ill to possess guns or banning guns in sensitive buildings and schools. But there was more in the Heller decision than limited regulation. It introduced a term called in common use.
That suggests that perhaps if a gun that some state labels as an assault weapon is nonetheless really quite common in the rest of the country, maybe the state can't ban it, even if lots of other guns are available to citizens of that state, because that's a gun in common use. Again, we don't know for sure.
We're starting to see the lower federal courts take Heller and McDonald very seriously. The types of arms that are going to be protected are the ones that you would have shown up with at militia muster, and the AR-15 is the quintessential modern militia weapon.
This common use portion of the Heller decision may have long-term consequences for any future assault weapon bans and those on the books in places like California.
That's a big part of the argument against certain types of firearms is this is military grade or there's no reason for an average person to have this kind of firearm. But the reality is that those types of firearms are incredibly popular and common for hunting and other recreational sporting purposes.
Why do AR-15s and other modern sporting rifles generate so much fear?
I think the fear of the black rifle came from people who don't understand guns, never been around guns, and the confusion that was perpetrated by the media.
They are military-style weapons, and they don't belong in the streets of our cities.
What is an assault weapon?
There are different definitions of what makes an assault weapon, but it typically differentiates an assault weapon from other semi-automatic weapons through a set of features that are designed to demonstrate that a gun is only made for the purpose of taking human life. So one feature that you hear talked about a lot is the pistol grip. You're not using the gun to put it on your shoulder and to aim, but more to literally shoot from the hip, which you would only do in a mass shooting.
That's just pure nonsense, because if I really want to be effective with my gun, I'm going to use my sights and look and see what I want to, aim at.
Another one is a barrel shroud, the thing that covers the barrel of a gun. So when you're firing multiple rounds in quick succession, you can still hold the pistol grip and hold the barrel so that it doesn't get excessively hot. So again, something that's only made for the purpose of taking human life.
There's no common sense to it. It makes no sense. Basically, they think these features somehow improve the lethality of a firearm, and they simply do not.
What's a barrel shroud, and why should we regulate it?
I actually don't know what a barrel shroud is.
Because it's in your
a shoulder thing that goes up.
No, it's not.
So the whole idea was basically to demonize certain class of firearms in order to make it easier to take them out of circulation.
Politicians focus on restricting assault rifles primarily because it's an easy target in political terms. And you can kind of nick away at gun ownership, one gun type at a time. So that's part of the incrementalist strategy. It's such a slippery definition, it can easily be expanded. There really is no rational reason for focusing on assault rifles in particular. There's really nothing to distinguish so-called assault rifles from other rifles. If anything, they're less dangerous, taken one shot at a time, because they tend to be smaller caliber rifles.
When we're talking about rounds like something fired from like the AR-15, the 223 or 5.56 round, we're talking about a round that was originally made for the Vietnam War and was designed to basically wound enemy troops. As opposed to something like a hunting round, there's a big difference in that.
All right, so we're going to look at two different bullet types here for sporting rifles. This is a 223 or 5.56 cartridge. This is what we're going to shoot in an AR-15. Now I'm going to fire. If we sort of look back at yesteryear and think about, what your grandfather shot, we look at something like this 30-06 cartridge. This is, in fact, a 30 caliber projectile as compared to the 22 caliber projectile in the 223 or 5.56 round. We're going to be firing this 30-06 projectile in a World War II era vintage M1 Garand.
When I'm watching television and I see some reporter on there that's saying that an assault weapon or any weapon that fires one of these high-powered rounds is meant to kill, and that's all it's used for, that's not true at all.
I want to limit the automatic guns, and I also want to limit the 100-bullet magazines that they hold.
And they just don't know what they're even talking about, but because they think it's gonna be good for their news program, and it's exploitative yellow journalism.
We're talking about millions of kids dying, being shot down by assault weapons.
They're just making things up that they think people will believe, and the problem is a lot of people who don't have the knowledge will believe it.
Yet the politicians continue their call for banning the AR-15, saying such a ban will reduce gun crime.
It's easy to use, has tremendous killing power, and tears young bodies apart.
Less than 1% of all gun crimes in America are committed with what even could be broadly defined as an assault weapon, and assault rifles would just be one subset of that, and a relatively small one. But that are involved in crime, that's pretty close to zero. It's freakishly rare.
Chosen for its lightweight, ease of shooting, and the ability to be customized to meet the shooter's needs, whether it's hunting, competitive shooting, or just plinking on the weekend with the family. The AR-15 is America's favorite gun. It is also one of the most selected guns for personal defense to stop home invasions or the rare moments when society temporarily ceases to be civil. On the morning of August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall on the coast of Louisiana. The Category 4 cyclone generated a tidal surge as high as 18 feet.
Some surge. Surge is coming over the road.
And overwhelmed the inadequate levee system that protected the city of New Orleans. The resulting flooding and storm damage killed over 1,500.
Right next to her on the ground was another body wrapped in a white sheet.
The natural disaster also set up one of the biggest civil rights abuses in this country's history since the Civil Rights Movement.
It was armed robbery by cop. They were stealing
legally owned property from private citizens. They were confiscating guns. The Second Amendment guarantees the right to keep and bear arms.
Constitutionally guaranteed or not, the thin veneer of civilization was washed away with the title surge, taking the Second, Fourth, and Fifth Amendments along with it. To understand why law enforcement broke their oath to uphold the Constitution, the events that occurred in the days preceding and after the storm must be taken into consideration.
A lot of these people that elected to stay, they said, I'm not leaving and turning my house and my property and all of my belongings over to thugs and looters. So they elected to stay. They stockpiled, and they stockpiled guns and provisions and food and water, and they stayed.
These individuals dug in and rode out the storm, and then dealt with the storm surge and flooding that followed.
And then later on, the next day, when some of the water subsided, that's when a little bit of the action started, where a lot of undesirables came out in stolen vehicles, started breaking into the businesses in the area, loading it up, and running down the street to wherever they were storing it and coming back and doing the same. And at that time is when I pulled out my guns and just sat out front with my shotgun to let them know that nobody's messing with us here. It's a safe house. We might have had a few confrontations with people, but we just told them to go in their own way.
The two great misconceptions of Katrina, or the aftermath of Katrina: number one, that there was martial law, and number two, that you had to leave if there was a mandatory evacuation order.
Every person is hereby ordered to immediately evacuate.
Take the second one first. A mandatory evacuation order is simply a way for the government to cover itself. But most people don't understand that, and they think that because there is a mandatory evacuation order, if you violate it, then you're violating some sort of a law. Unfortunately, a lot of police officers believe that. The other great misconception is that New Orleans is under martial law. And there was no martial law in New Orleans, but everybody was saying martial law, and the police thought that they had extraordinary powers.
With looters running wild, armed citizens protecting their property, and pressure on the government to get things under control, a perfect civil storm followed Katrina's path.
One of the largest contingents of people you had down there was reporters. And they're wandering around looking for stories, and they would walk up to somebody they saw cleaning up storm debris, and they'd stick a camera on them and a microphone, and they would say, well, what do you think about the way things are going?
It's just hard for me to believe that this is America. And the city of New Orleans cut all utilities. They cut cell phone use, they cut gas, water, electricity. There was no presence of any kind from city government, not one New Orleans police officer, nobody from FEMA, nobody from City Hall.
All right, so people here feeling scared about what this night's going to bring and feeling neglected by their government officials.
And that just opened the torrent. That opened the floodgate, and they criticized everybody, but particularly Ray Nagin. They really wore Nagin out. Nagin got tired of it. He got tired of all the bad press, and he told Eddie Compass, the police chief, run them out. Push them. Just get them out of here.
One such person was Patricia Connie, a 67-year-old pensioner living on her own with her 2 dogs.
You say guns will be taken? No one will be able to be armed. We will take all weapons.
When the police came and knocked at my door, and they're asking me, aren't you afraid of looters? I said, looters? I said, I'm more afraid of you than I am looters.
Well, I don't want you in here. I don't want you in here, period.
The police continued to question Patricia while pushing their way into her house, asking her if she had any weapons.
It was the Louisiana sheriffs and the California Highway Patrol. When they attacked me, they looked like fullbacks coming to you.
And he dropped. When he dropped, he wrenched her sideways, her face hit her own cabinet, broke a tooth, blacked her eye, and she cracked her shoulder in 3 places, all over a little pocket pistol that didn't have any bullets in it. They violated the Second Amendment, right to keep and bear arms. They violated the Fourth Amendment, to be safe and secure in your own home. They violated all of that.
Homeowners had armed themselves to protect their mansions. Residents were handcuffed on the ground. In the end, police took their weapons but let them stay in their homes.
The gun confiscations extended out of the city limits into the surrounding parishes.
St. Tammany Water Patrol deputies were out in boats, stopping boats and confiscating guns from people.
I wanted to get back to my home. I lived in Venetian Isles, which is probably half a mile at the most, and obtained some of my valuables that we left in the house. And the only way to get back to Venetian Isles was by boat. So I called my good friend Wayne and asked him to give me a ride back to the house.
Wayne and Richard made the journey across the lake to Venetian Isle and recovered the valuables.
One thing he really wanted to save was an antique shotgun that had been given to him by his grandfather. There was deer rifles and handguns and stuff like that, but he really wanted that shotgun.
Wrapped the old guns and valuables and stuff in blankets and stuck them inside the boat. Left here and went back toward the Wrigley's where we had parked the automobile and the trailer.
And they were coming out of the community, and they were stopped.
There was a sheriff's boat coming toward us. I told Wayne, I said, they're probably going to stop us to see what's going on because they, we're checking for looting. And the first thing we hear is, stop the boat. Put your hands in the air.
Hands up! Keep your hands up!
So we started to say something, and they hollered again, put your hands in the air. And they all got rifles on us. So we put our hands in the air. And they came alongside of us and asked us if we had any guns on the boat. I said, yeah, we got guns on the boat. We got 2 pistols for protection.
I thought they were going to shoot us. They made us get out of my boat and get in his boat. They said, we'll find them.
And they proceeded to find them. They tore them up out of the bottoms of the boat, took them out of the blankets, held them in bunches at a time, handing them inside the boat to the other people. All the time, there's 2 Army personnel with M16s facing us, which I didn't enjoy at all, but there's nothing we could say. What other way could you feel? These were sheriff's people that were supposed to be protecting us. We weren't doing anything wrong. We were just protecting our valuables, bringing our valuables away from the looters that supposedly we were told were breaking into our homes. I think all total, between the 2 pistols, the few rifles I had, and some shotguns, I think it was a total of 9 that they took from us.
In the weeks after the storm, much of the law enforcement knew the difference between an armed citizen and a looter.
They didn't mess with us. They looked at us and they just kept going. And then eventually St. Claude was the only street that they could access the lower 9th Ward on, and that's when a lot of the rescue people started going down St. Claude, down the lower 9th Ward. And all the police, firemen, or whoever came by saw that I had a weapon, and I told them it was a safe house here, and it was fine with them. It didn't faze them at all.
But Joanna's civil rights eventually ran out.
Well, it was about 12 days later. By that time, the city was getting pretty thin as far as people go, because there was no signs of any energy trucks out or anybody trying to bring in utilities back in. The military was just patrolling, setting up roadblocks on the street, and then this one day we had about a dozen U.S. Marshals coming down the street. They saw me with my shotgun. They pointed all their M16s at me and said to put it down. They pulled everybody out of the bar, put everybody up against the walls, ran makes on everybody, took all my weapons, didn't say a word, and left. And I never got them back again.
Post-Katrina New Orleans is a glaring example of the government, or at least a handful of misguided law enforcement officers, suspending our civil rights in the name of public safety. But what happens to our public servants' promise of protecting innocent civilians when the firepower is controlled by a mob?
I have experienced something where I found out for the first time that anarchy can take place in this country when you have to be able to defend yourself and defend your own properties.
On the afternoon of April 29, 1992, South Central Los Angeles and surrounding neighborhoods erupted in violence after a jury acquitted 4 LA police officers of excessive force and abuse during the arrest of Rodney King. Race tensions came to a head, and mobs of gangs filled the streets, looking to loot and destroy everything in their path.
When the police decided to withdraw from the riot flashpoint of Florence and Normandy, I think it just became an all-out rioting by the street gangs. There were a lot of Korean merchants who were doing businesses in South Central at the time, and they're the ones who sustained most of the damages. There was nothing we could do except listen to the calling from the people who were stranded there who couldn't get police help.
With no police protection, the whole area around South Central is left in chaos and mob rule, like something out of an apocalyptic movie.
When we heard the following day that the African-American gangs were now targeting Koreatown, which is 2 miles north of South Central Los Angeles, We immediately went to the police and said, you know, look, I mean, you guys need to put up a blockade and make sure that these gang members cannot come up to our neighborhood. But unfortunately, the LAPD was not ready, and they told us instead to vacate the town. But we cannot let 25 years of our hard work go up in smoke. As a result, my having been an attorney for the Korean American radio station that had 24-hour broadcast, I went to the radio station and basically explained to them that despite what the police are telling you, that we have a right to defend ourselves. We need to defend by arming ourselves.
With personal arms, including AR-15s and shotguns, the residents of Koreatown prepared to hold off the gangs.
I think the police did not have leadership, and at the same time, they were very timid about going out there and looking like they were attacking the African Americans because of possible repercussions. And because of that, they felt urban warfare would be a very deadly thing for which they felt that they were not trained. And I think that was very legitimate on the part of the police officers, not wanting to be in the harm's way, especially when they were in disarray and they were not organized to defend against situations like that.
The Korean businessmen defended their businesses and neighborhoods for 3 days until the National Guard showed up.
During those 3 days and 3 nights, the civilization as we knew it broke down rather quickly. The media's attempt to get the viewership didn't help much either. And as a result, the law enforcement was immobilized. Those Korean immigrants who were there trying to protect their stores were very surprised to find out that in a country that they had considered to be the most civilized, something like this could happen within hours.
What Americans witnessed over those 3 days of rioting was how ultimately they are responsible for their own safety and well-being. It is not the state's responsibility to protect them. That is what the Founding Fathers knew when they wrote the Second Amendment. They knew that a civil society only exists when people are respectful of others. Governments are only as good as those elected, and evil does walk amongst us. The right to defend oneself is not like a permit to drive. It is the most sacred civil right. The Koreans of LA learned that lesson the hard way.
Because of the riots experience, I think the Korean American community have become a little bit more aware. We do need to prevent something like that happening by dealing with these things before it gets out of hand. I think we all need to be vigilant and make sure that something like that doesn't happen. But I think, as we know, in a country, laissez-faire, capitalistic society such as ours, where politicians are always out there trying to work for themselves more so than the needs of the society, do we really trust our government to be there when they're needed?
Concealed carry is a woman's issue because firearms uniquely empower women to protect themselves. What we find is that when a woman gets a firearm, she is able to defend herself without using a great deal of muscle power, without spending years learning martial arts. She's just able to pick up the gun and immediately is able to protect herself.
Concealed carry laws vary state to state. Some states like Arizona have constitutional carry laws, which means as long as the individual can legally own a firearm, they can carry concealed. Other states are shall-issue states. They give permits to those that qualify. And others are may-issue states, where the decision is left up to law enforcement to determine if the applicant has good cause. In these may-issue states and in Illinois, the individual's right to carry beyond the threshold of their home is being challenged in the courts.
What Heller told us was that the core value protected by the Second Amendment was the right to have the means of self-defense. Many of the legal treatises that Heller drew upon explored the right of self-defense as it arose outside the home. Some of our opponents like to think that the right is limited to the home because they just don't want to see it go any further. But that's not what the Second Amendment provides. It's not what Heller provides. And in due time, we expect it's not what the courts are going to provide as they examine this further.
There's a lot of talk about what are the statistical impacts of letting people conceal carry. And what we know is there's no negative impacts. It's at least that justifiable homicides go up and regular homicides don't. We also know that concealed carry licensees are much more law-abiding than the average citizen. In fact, might be more law-abiding than police officers. And it really changes the way you behave when you're carrying. All of a sudden, somebody calling your mother a hamster isn't something you want to escalate because it causes this entire knock-on conversation with yourself about, Is this guy going to punch me? Am I going to be forced to shoot him to retain my firearm? Am I going to kill someone? Am I going to have all of the legal implications, the legal death that can be? Do I really want to take it that seriously? It really makes stark the decision to defend yourself.
After the Newtown massacre, Wayne LaPierre, the CEO of the NRA, went on the defensive when lawmakers and the media called for new gun control bans and regulations. At a news conference a week after the tragedy, LaPierre called for a good guy with a gun to stop mass shooters like Lanza and Holmes. The media and the opposition challenged his statements, but what they forgot was that in 2007, a good woman with a gun stopped a mass killer named Matthew Murray. Murray had killed 4 at the Youth with a Mission Center in Arvada, Colorado, before he decided to assault the New Life Church in Colorado Springs.
All we know is that a gunman opened fire here in the parking lot at New Life Church right behind me, shooting 5 people. 1 died at the scene. So did the gunman, who was shot.
An armed citizen can stop evil. It's not a far-fetched idea left for debates on Sunday morning news programs. It happened in Athens, Tennessee. It happened on those moonless nights in Mississippi when the Ku Klux Klan rode against equal rights. It happened in New Orleans and in Los Angeles when society collapsed. And it happens over 1 million times a year when law-abiding individuals use their guns in self-defense. The Founding Fathers understood the natural law of self-defense and ensured it for all when they wrote the Second Amendment. Why would our elected servants want to infringe on this vital and empowering civil right?
Should we be focused on gun violence as a problem? Sure. I mean, it's a serious problem, but focusing on it as gun violence, the emphasis on gun, rather than focusing on violence, that's where the problem lies.
The reaction by a number of the politicians, most of which, of course, are anti-gun and have been for a long time, have been to try and use the Newtown shootings any way they can to propose as many anti-gun laws as they can and put their anti-gun agenda in place. So far, they've come out basically with what I'd call a wish list. And you name it, what's on there, from registration to so-called background checks that really are a national registration system, to banning guns, to banning ammunition feeding devices, gun magazines, making it difficult to get permits. They basically throw every roadblock they can up and hope something sticks.
This is a very complex issue, the issue of violence in general, the issue of gun violence in particular. There are a lot of contributing factors, socioeconomics, mental health, all these things. There are a lot of valid conversations that we should be having. And we should be having that conversation with a respect for the Second Amendment, a respect for the fact that most gun owners are decent, law-abiding citizens.
It's the people. Anything can be construed as a weapon. My vehicle, if I decide to drive into a crowd of people and injure them, is in essence a weapon. Unfortunately, there's bad people wherever we go. Those people are the people that are causing the problems.
How do we identify and treat people who are mentally unstable or those who are likely to commit crimes? How do we prevent weapons from getting into the hands of mentally unstable individuals? And we can do that through background checks. We're working with psychiatric professionals that are feeding information into a database, and so if you have to get a background check, if your name comes up in that system, then obviously you don't qualify to own a firearm. I think it's sensible ideas like that that we should be talking about. Instead, our politicians are polarized around this concept of assault weapons. That's really, I think, just missing the point. Any gun laws that we have should be focused on reducing crime, and if they're not going to reduce crime or prevent crime, then really what good are they?
I give this to the gun banners. I'm in full agreement with them that I'd like to stop violence, okay? The problem is that there's almost a philosophic issue there, okay? How do you maintain your freedoms under our Constitution and deprive people of the means of self-defense in your attempt to try and prevent what are actually rare occurrences? Gun crime is actually down in this country. Violent crime overall is down in this country. Okay, and people just refuse to acknowledge these statistics. Yet firearm ownership is at an all-time high.
Most gun control laws are highly unlikely to do any good. Some of them are unlikely to do much harm either. But some of them are likely to interfere with self-defense with very little crime control benefit. By and large, most murders and an even larger share of other gun crimes are committed by people who are pretty committed criminals. If they are unwilling to follow the laws against murder or against robbery, they are unlikely to follow laws against possessing guns.
Our rich republic can't be there if we don't respect the Bill of Rights. And in fact, it's surprising how well the Bill of Rights has actually endured over time. And so as we move forward into the future, we need to respect each and every one of those civil rights, because with it, we can have that republic that Franklin said, if you can keep it.
So the question becomes, how much of our civil rights are we willing to give up for a sense of safety? Do we give up the right to be protected from unlawful search and seizure? Our right of privacy? Our right of self-defense? Do we abandon our natural rights for a promise of safety that the government can't or won't provide when we need it? The civil rights of the people are the basis of our society, and if we surrender one, we surrender them all. It also established that the right could be reasonably regulated. That's an interesting term, reasonably regulated. Here's the rules, but they can be regulated. What the fuck does that mean?